My name is Marisol Vance. I'm 28 years old, and 2 days before my wedding, my parents cornered me in a church dressing room and handed me an ultimatum. Take my grandfather off the head table, or they would walk out of my rehearsal and out of my wedding entirely. He's a retired custodian, my father said, straightening his cufflinks like the sentence needed pressing. He embarrasses us. That custodian packed my school lunches for 12 straight years. My family thought the worst thing that could happen at my reception was 200 guests watching a man with rough, working hands sit beside the bride. They were wrong. What happened when my father's CEO set down his champagne, buttoned his jacket, and walked straight across that ballroom floor? I promise you, my parents never once saw it coming, and even I didn't know the whole of it. Welcome back to Untold Secret Hub, where family secrets surface and quiet people finally get their say. Every week we share stories about standing your ground with the people who share your name. If you believe the ones who actually raised you deserve the seat of honor, you're in the right place. Drop a comment, subscribe, because this story does not end where you think it does. I was 6 years old the summer my parents moved to Charlotte. My father had landed a position at Ridgeline Logistics, a freight and shipping company with 9,000 employees, and a glass headquarters he talked about like it was a cathedral. My mother went with him to sell houses to other people climbing the same ladder. I stayed behind in Asheville with Grandpa Frank, because it was just for a year, sweetheart, until we're settled. 1 year became elementary school, then middle school, then my entire childhood. Grandpa's house smelled like lemon floor polish and percolated coffee, and dinner hit the table at 5:30 sharp whether the world cooperated or not. He was the head custodian at Lindale Elementary, the very school I attended. And every evening, when he locked those heavy front doors behind the last bus, he said the same words like a small prayer with a mop handle attached to it. Leave every room better than you found it. He said it when I spilled tempera paint across the art room floor and stayed after to scrub it clean myself. He said it when I cracked Mrs. Farnham's classroom window with a kickball and spent a whole summer earning back the glass. He said it so often that eventually I stopped hearing it, the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat. My parents drove down from Charlotte every couple of months, and I'll be fair to them. They never once missed a birthday. But their visits felt less like family and more like inspections. My father reviewed my report cards the way he reviewed quarterly shipping numbers, hunting for the dip. And every time they left, my mother would pause on the porch and glance back at Grandpa's tidy little house. The clean gutters, the straight fence line, the flag by the door. The exact way she looked at a listing she couldn't quite move. I didn't have a word for that look when I was 9. I have one now. Here's what you need to understand about my parents. My father, Douglas Vance, is 56, Senior Director of Regional Operations at Ridgeline, and he irons his weekend shirts. My mother, Pamela, is 53, a top producing realtor in Charlotte with a billboard on Interstate 77 and a laugh she reserves strictly for clients. They aren't cruel people. They're worse than cruel in a way that's harder to explain out loud. They keep score. Love in my parents' house was a scoreboard. Grades were points. Colleges were points. Job titles were the playoffs. When I was 21, I called to tell them I'd passed the exam and landed a position as a rural mail carrier out of Asheville. Benefits, a pension, a union, and work I could genuinely be proud of on a route where people actually knew my name. My father went quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "And you're happy telling people that?" He didn't yell. He never yells. He just filed me a little lower on the board and moved on to the next topic. My mother mailed me a blazer for interviews someday. I wore it exactly once, to a funeral. But the strangest thing, the thing I noticed for years without fully understanding it, was how my father treated Grandpa Frank. He didn't argue with him, he erased him. Company picnics, holiday parties. The year Dad made senior director and rented out half a steakhouse to celebrate, Grandpa was never invited. Not once. And Grandpa never said a single word about it. I asked my father about it exactly one time, at Thanksgiving the year I turned 24. His face closed like a garage door coming down. Some worlds shouldn't mix, Marisol. That was the entire answer. It would be 4 more years before I understood exactly what he was so afraid of. And by then, the wedding invitations already had my name printed on them. Caleb Rise proposed to me on my mail route, which tells you basically everything you need to know about him. He teaches 10th grade biology. He laughs at his own jokes half a second too early. And one Wednesday in March, he was waiting at the very last mailbox on Hollow Creek Road, holding a small velvet box like it was a certified letter I had to sign for. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. We wanted something simple. Ivy Hall in Asheville. 200 guests if both families sprawled out, my grandfather at the head table, and a honeymoon we could pay for in cash. Then came the engagement dinner in Charlotte. My mother set the table with the good china nobody's actually allowed to eat off of. And after the salad course, my father slid an envelope across the tablecloth like a man closing a deal. Inside was a check for $28,000. So it's done properly, he said. My mother touched my wrist. Think of it as staging, honey. Weddings are listings. Presentation is everything. I want to be honest with you here, because it matters later. I hesitated. I'd been managing my parents my entire life, translating them for other people, sanding down their edges. And some tired part of me thought, take the check, keep the peace, you know exactly how to handle them. So I said thank you. I said it would be a gift, not a vote. My father smiled and agreed a little too quickly. And then, while my mother refilled the wine, he slid a second thing across the table. A monogrammed leather folder, the kind he carries into board reviews. Just a few thoughts, he said, on the guest list. I opened it expecting the names of cousins. What I found instead was an org chart with place settings. My father's guest list had 24 names on it, and I had never once shared a meal with a single one of them. Regional directors. 2 vice presidents, the head of West Coast distribution, and at the very top, underlined twice, Marcus Everly Holt, Chief Executive Officer of Ridgeline Logistics. My wedding had become a business function, scheduled somewhere between the appetizers and the cake. It took me a week of phone calls to understand exactly why. Ridgeline's Senior Vice President of Operations had retired in February. The chair sat empty, and my father had spent 19 years positioning himself exactly one rung below it. A wedding was the one event on the calendar where he could put a CEO, a string quartet, and his own last name in the same room and call it family. I did what I always did. I managed it. I gave up the band I actually wanted because Mom said fiddles read as county fair. I gave up my florist because Mom had a girl. I told myself each surrender was small. That piece was worth more than centerpieces, that I was keeping the important things. Caleb watched me negotiate away my own wedding, one voicemail at a time, and finally said, gently, you keep calling it their event. I laughed it off. Then the seating chart arrived. My mother emailed it on a Sunday night, color-coded, professionally rendered, with Ridgeline executives fanned out around the dance floor like a security detail. I found Caleb's parents at a side table. I found my college roommate seated by the restrooms. And then I found my grandfather, the man who taught me to ride a bike in a school parking lot. At table 16, back corner, next to the kitchen door, behind a support column where the photographs would never reach. I called my mother before I'd even finished scrolling. I kept my voice level, because level is the only voice that actually works on Pamela Vance. Grandpa raised me. He sits at the head table. My mother sighed the sigh she reserves for buyers who want granite on a laminate budget. Sweetheart, the head table is for the wedding party and the hosts, and we are hosting. It's cleaner this way. Cleaner. I wrote the word down on the back of an envelope, just so I'd stop hearing it echo. When I drove over to Grandpa's that evening, he was oiling the hinges on his screen door, because in Frank Vance's world, a squeak is a moral failing. I told him about table 16. I was ready to be furious for both of us. He just wiped his hands on the rag that lives permanently in his back pocket and said, I've sat in worse seats, kiddo. Don't burn down your family over a chair. That's the thing about my grandfather, 79 years old, and I had never once heard him fight for his own dignity. I used to think he simply didn't know how. It never once occurred to me that a man could be so certain of something that he doesn't need other people to vote on it. Before I left, I noticed his good suit hanging on the closet door, freshly pressed from the cleaners, brown shoes polished and lined up beneath it. Once a year, every year, for as long as I could remember, Grandpa put on that suit and drove downtown to what he called his pension meeting. He was gone all afternoon that particular Thursday. He came home with a silver ballpoint pen tucked in his shirt pocket, engraved with a tiny compass rose. I remember thinking it looked expensive for a pension office. I didn't ask. If you want to understand my father, you have to go back to a cafeteria in 1985. And I only know about it because of my Aunt Rita, Dad's older sister. Over coffee that week, while she was trying to talk me into flexibility on the seating, the story slipped out. Douglas was 13. Grandpa was the maintenance man at the old Sanders freight depot back then. And everybody at school knew it. Because a town that size knows everything about everybody. One lunch period, a table of boys whose fathers wore ties decided to have some fun. They soaked a rag from the janitor's cart in the water fountain and dropped it square on my father's lunch tray, right on his food. One of them leaned in close and said, "Your dad missed a spot." The whole table laughed. Rita says Douglas didn't say a word. He walked home, threw his tray story at Grandpa like an accusation, and begged him to get a different job. Any job, one with a desk. And Grandpa, who had a mortgage and 2 kids and a wife starting to get sick, said the only thing he actually knew how to say. Work is work. Rita swears Dad never forgave that sentence. He mowed lawns until he could afford clothes nobody could laugh at. He was the first Vance to finish college. He's spent nearly 40 years making absolutely sure no one could ever drop a rag on his tray again. I sat in that coffee shop and ached for a 13-year-old boy I'd never met. Then I remembered that boy was 56 now, and the man he kept throwing rags at was his own father. That Sunday, my mother texted, "Family meeting at our house. We need to discuss presentation." The family meeting had a slide deck. I wish I were exaggerating. I drove the 90 minutes to Charlotte and sat at my parents' kitchen island, while my father clicked through a presentation titled Vance. Rye's wedding run of show. Ridgeline's little compass logo ghosted faintly in the corner of every slide, like a watermark nobody was supposed to notice. There was a timeline. There was a photo protocol, which mostly meant which backdrops Mom had pre-approved, and then, second to last slide in that same clean corporate font. Seating optics. My father set down the clicker and talked to me the way he talks to underperforming terminals. Marcus Holt will be seated 18 feet from the head table. Every director in the region will have a direct sight line to your chair. And 4 feet away, he said, we will have a retired school custodian in a department store suit. That's the story the company tells on Monday. That's the only story. Grandpa sits at the head table, I said, and my voice didn't shake, which I was proud of, because my hands were another matter entirely. My father looked at me the way he looks at a number that won't reconcile. Then he said the sentence he'd clearly rehearsed, in the car, in the mirror, his whole life. People remember the mop Marisol, not the man. My mother studied her quartz countertop. $4,000, by the way. She'd have mentioned it. I picked up my keys and told them the seating chart was done being discussed, and my father called after me, calm as a weather forecast. Then you'd better hope nobody asks him what he did for a living. I sat in my car in their driveway for 10 full minutes before I trusted my own hands on the wheel. If you've ever had to explain to your own family why the person who actually raised you deserves a seat at your table, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one of them on my lunch break, parked in my mail truck. And subscribe if you're staying with me, because what my parents did at that rehearsal still puts a tremor in my voice. And what a stranger in a better suit did 2 days later changed every single thing my family believed about itself. My mother doesn't argue. She campaigns. Within a week, my phone had become a switchboard. Aunt Rita called first, and the warmth from our coffee date had already been replaced with talking points. Your father has worked 19 years for this opening, Marisol. It's one dinner. One evening of your grandfather sitting somewhere comfortable. Don't cost your dad his shot at that chair. I asked her if she remembered telling me the cafeteria story. She said that was different. And then she couldn't quite explain how, and then she had a casserole in the oven. My cousin Devon texted an entire paragraph about keeping the peace for the older generation, which was rich, considering the older generation in question was the one being hidden behind a support column. Even our officiant got a friendly call from Pamela Vance about streamlining the family elements of the ceremony. He told me about it with a raised eyebrow and let it die there. Bless him. By Friday I understood the full shape of it. My parents weren't lobbying for a seating chart. They were recruiting witnesses, so that when I finally gave in, it would look like consensus instead of surrender. And here's the part that genuinely scared me. It was working. I know how that sounds. But when every phone call for an entire week tells you that you're the unreasonable one, you start doing math on your own heart whether you want to or not. Then Caleb came home from parent-teacher conferences and mentioned, too casually, that his mother had gotten a call from mine, something about the rehearsal dinner menu, and a gentle suggestion regarding the appropriate volume for the groom's side of the family. Caleb's parents are retired schoolteachers. My mother had rated them like a property listing. That was the night I stopped doing the math. That Sunday, Caleb's parents had us all over for dinner, including Grandpa, whom they'd invited with an actual mailed card, because Marjorie Reyes believes in stamps. I watched my grandfather walk into a house he'd never once set foot in and get treated like a visiting dignitary. Caleb's father wanted his opinion on a sagging gutter. His mother wanted the story about the winter of '79 again. At some point their screen door started catching, and Grandpa had it fixed in 10 minutes with a screwdriver he pulled from his truck. Nobody was embarrassed. Nobody apologized for him, and I sat there with my dinner roll, realizing I had never once in 22 years seen my grandfather relaxed at my parents' table. On the drive home, Caleb finally asked the question he'd been carrying all night. The father-daughter dance. What are you going to do? I stared straight at the road, because here was the truth I hadn't said out loud yet. I was still planning to dance with my father. Tradition is tradition, I told Caleb. You only get one. He let that sit for a while, then said simply, sure. And who taught you to dance? I didn't answer. The answer was a kitchen in Asheville, a transistor radio, a 60-year-old man counting 1, 2, 3 while an 11-year-old stood balanced on his shoe tops after her parents had canceled another visit. I turned the radio up, and Caleb, who knows exactly when a fact needs time to finish its work, let me have the silence. The next morning, my mother called about the dress fitting. She'd finalized the family photo list with the photographer, she said, and read me every name off it. It took me until the very end of the list to notice the one name that wasn't there. That missing name was the tremor before the earthquake, because that same week, I discovered exactly what the $28,000 had actually purchased. I called our caterer to swap the fish course and got a puzzled pause. Oh, we'll need Mrs. Vance to approve that. She's the signer now. The signer. While I'd been fending off phone calls all week, my mother had quietly upgraded the catering package and signed the contract under her own name. Same with the photographer, whose new invoice listed a second shooter dedicated specifically to the corporate guests. A phrase I hope never to type again as long as I live. It wasn't theft. It was neater than theft. Whoever signs decides. My mother has said that about real estate my whole life, and I never once imagined I'd become the property. I sat at my kitchen table that night with every wedding document I owned, and Caleb graded essays across from me, and I sorted paper the way I sort mail, ruthlessly. Florist, there's caterer, there's photographer, there's. And then, at the very bottom of the pile, the venue. Ivy Hall, booked 11 months ago. Deposit paid straight from my own checking account. One signature on the line, and the signature was mine. I put my finger on it and left it there a while. My parents had bought the flowers, the food, and the pictures. They had not bought the room. Caleb looked up, saw my face, and set down his red pen. You've got that route look, he said. What route look? The one where the dog's loose and you deliver the street anyway. I slept better that night than I had in 3 weeks. In the morning, I drove to Grandpa's to tell him my plan, and instead he made me an offer that broke my heart a little. He poured my coffee, sat me down at the kitchen table where I'd done homework for 11 straight years, and slid a folded piece of paper across the wood. It was a savings account statement. I've got a little put by, he said. Take it, no strings. Strings are your parents' hobby, not mine. I looked at the number, which was modest and careful. Exactly what you'd expect from a man who darns his own socks. And I couldn't say anything for a second, because my throat had quit on me. A man who'd worked 45 years was offering to empty his drawer for a party. I told him no. I told him his job was to wear his good suit, sit exactly where I put him, and save me one dance if his knee allowed it. He grumbled that his knee was fine, which it isn't. On my way out, I stopped where I always stop, at the crooked row of pictures in the hallway. Grandma Louise in her Easter hat. My mail truck photo from the local paper, and one I'd walked past 1,000 times without truly looking at it. A young man, unmistakably my grandfather, wary and grinning, standing beside a truck cab with Sanders Freight painted across the door. He wasn't holding a mop in the photograph. He was holding a roll of paper, big sheets curled like blueprints, and there was a pencil tucked behind his ear. "Grandpa, what's this from?" He came and stood beside me with his coffee and looked at it far longer than the question needed. "I kept their floors," he said finally. "And a few other things." Then he asked if I wanted pie, in the voice that means the subject is closed. I let it close. 3 weeks later I would remember that pencil. On a Tuesday, 2.5 weeks before the wedding, I took a vacation day and drove Grandpa to Lyndale Elementary, because he still volunteers there one morning a month, fixing what the district won't pay to fix. I hadn't been inside since 6th grade. The hallways had shrunk the way childhood hallways always do, and I got to watch something I'd been too young to notice the first time. The way that building treats Frank Vance. The office staff lit up. The retired cafeteria manager, Miss Odessa, who comes in Tuesdays to run the food pantry, hugged him and called him Mr. Vance in the tone people usually save for surgeons. A janitor 30 years his junior trailed him around like a resident on rounds. And over the door of the old custodian's closet, laminated and sun-faded, a strip of paper in my grandfather's blocky handwriting. "Leave every room better than you found it." He'd taped it there for the kids, Odessa told me. Teachers still point to it. While Grandpa rewired a leaking water fountain, Odessa fed me coffee, cake, and gossip. Then she said the thing that snagged. "You know that day he dresses up every year. Town car comes for him. Long black thing, driver in a suit. First time I saw it I said Frank who died, and he laughed and said, 'Nobody, Odessa. Some old paperwork just refuses to quit.' A town car for a pension meeting." I chewed my coffee cake and filed it in the drawer, where you put things that don't fit anywhere yet. Then I looked up at the sign over the door one more time, and made the decision I'd been circling for a week. It was time to give something back better than I'd found it. The next morning, I drove to Charlotte with an envelope of my own. My parents' kitchen island is white quartz, $4,000, and I know that because my mother tells everyone. I set the envelope on it. Inside was their check. $28,000 intact, undeposited, 3 months old, and one typed page. What I was canceling: the upgraded catering package, the corporate photographer, the fern wall florist. What I was keeping: Ivy Hall, whose contract had my name on it, and every promise I'd already made to people I actually loved. My father read the page like a resignation letter. My mother read the check like a death certificate. "You can't afford this wedding," she said, and she wasn't wrong. I told her the new wedding would be one I could afford, which was rather the entire point of weddings back when they still worked that way. Nobody yelled. My family doesn't yell. We just adjust our forecasts. I drove the 90 minutes home with the radio off and my spine straight. And that night, I sat at my own kitchen table with a calligraphy pen I'd bought for $9 and did the small thing that, looking back, turned out to be the whole war. I hand-lettered the place cards, all of them, and saved his for last. Brown ink, my very best letters, and set it upright on the windowsill over the sink where I'd see it every morning for the next 2 weeks. Frank Vance, head table. It's a strange thing, arming yourself with cardstock, but every morning while the coffee brewed, that little tent of paper stood there like a fence post, and I'd read it once and go deliver the mail. Thursday, my father's voicemail arrived. 11 seconds, flat as a shipping manifest. "You are embarrassing us in front of the most important people in my career." I replayed it 3 times. He never once noticed what he'd just ranked. Here's what a wedding looks like once you hand back $28,000. The string quartet became a retired middle school music teacher named Delphine, and the hall's old upright piano, tuned that Saturday by a man who owed Grandpa a favor from 1999. The fern wall became garden, roses cut from 3 different backyards along my mail route. Because when your customers hear your wedding lost its florist, women you've delivered mail to for 7 years start volunteering their gardens like it's a war effort. Miss Odessa commandeered the catering gap for cocktail hour, and the food pantry ladies baked like a denomination depended on it. Was I sad about any of it? I keep checking that pocket and finding it empty. My mother was sad enough for both of us. Without us, it's a potluck, not a wedding, she said on the phone, and then, in the silky voice she uses for closing, your father and I have been asking ourselves whether we can even attend something like this. There it was. The last card in the deck, played casually, like an afterthought. Attendance itself, I said. I hope you'll be there, and meant it, and hated that I meant it. We hung up on a silence with teeth in it. 2 days later, an RSVP card landed in my own mailbox, which still makes me smile, a mail carrier getting mail. Heavy cream stock, confident fountain pen. Marcus Everly Holt accepts with pleasure. The CEO of Ridgeline Logistics was coming to my potluck. I stood at my mailbox laughing, and then not quite laughing, because my father had invited the one guest he absolutely could not afford to be absent in front of. Whatever my parents decided about attending, that cream card had just decided it for them. My father called on a Sunday night with his negotiating voice fully engaged. All warm leather, no floor beneath it. He'd been thinking, he said. He wanted to offer a path forward. Option A: Grandpa attends the ceremony. The church part is fine, churches are humble, and then quietly skips the reception. He hates crowds anyway, he'd be relieved. Option B: Grandpa comes to the reception and sits at table 16, reframed now as a kindness. Near the exit, Marisol, for his comfort. The man is 79. I sat on my porch steps listening to my father redesign his own shame as chivalry, and I gave him credit. It was a better draft than the last one. When he finished, I said, he doesn't dislike crowds, Dad. He dislikes being hidden. Those are two very different things. A pause, then, quieter, with the leather worn thin. You don't understand what one dinner can cost a man. He was closer to honest in that single sentence than he'd been all year, and part of me wanted to meet him right there. Ask him about the boy with the tray. Tell him I already knew. Overmanaging my family is my oldest habit, and old habits reach for you hardest right before you finally quit them. But I looked through my kitchen window at a piece of cardstock standing on the windowsill, and I held my line right there on the porch, glad he couldn't see my free hand shaking. The seat is his, Dad. My father exhaled through his nose, the exact sound he makes when a vendor won't budge. Then we'll see who shows up, he said, and was gone. The rehearsal stood 4 days out. The officiant confirmed the next morning that my parents had called the church. They would be attending after all, to finalize arrangements. 2 nights before the rehearsal, I found Grandpa out on his porch, radio low, gluing the sole of a shoe a reasonable man would have buried years earlier. He didn't look up when he said it. Don't lose your family over a chair, kiddo. I can love you from any table in that room. I sat down on the step below him, the exact spot where I'd shelled beans and cried over boys and memorized state capitals. And for once, in my careful, managed, level-voiced life, I said the true thing with no packaging on it at all. You are my family. You're the one who stayed. The glue brush stopped moving. My grandfather looked out at the yard like something in the hedge needed his supervision, and he took off his glasses and cleaned them on his shirt tail for a long, long time. That's how men his age cry, if you've ever wondered. Then he put them back on and said, "Weather's turning." And I said, "It sure is," and we sat there in the kind of silence you can actually live inside. When I got up to leave, I watched through the window as he went inside to the old roll-top desk in the den. The one drawer he keeps locked, the key on the ring with all his brass school keys. He opened it and stood there looking down at something. A fat envelope was all I could see. Manila, soft at the corners like it had been handled for decades. He didn't take it out. He touched it once, the way you touch a headstone, then locked the drawer and switched off the lamp. I drove home telling myself it was pension papers, old deeds, a map. 2 nights later, my parents walked into the rehearsal 40 minutes early. I'm the kind of person who walks a new route before she carries a full bag on it, so the day before the rehearsal, I went to both buildings alone. At the church, I taped the processional order inside the vestibule door where nervous groomsmen would actually see it. At Ivy Hall, I stood in the empty ballroom with the venue manager, walked the floor plan one final time, and then did the thing I'd been saving. From my bag, I pulled the place cards, hand-lettered, rubber, banded by table, and set the head table myself. Caleb, me, his parents, his sister, and centered right beside the bride's seat, brown ink, my very best letters. Frank Vance, head table. I stood that little tent of cardstock next to a water glass, and it looked so small for a thing I'd bled over, and I said the words out loud to the empty room like a crazy person, because he wasn't there to say them for me. Leave every room better than you found it. Then I drove home past the church purely out of habit, the way you check a mailbox flag. And that's when my stomach dropped straight through the floorboards. At 7 o'clock on a Wednesday evening, my parents' silver sedan sat parked in the church lot. Rehearsal was Friday. Nobody had a reason to be there Wednesday. But there was my mother's shape in the passenger seat, the trunk standing open, and my father in his shirt sleeves, reading something off a printed page to the officiant on the front steps. My father does not arrive early. In 56 years, the man has never once been early out of enthusiasm. He arrives early to negotiate. Before we walk into that rehearsal together, let me ask you something. If your grandparents ever showed up for you when your own parents didn't, would you drop a like for them right now? Mine packed my lunches for 12 years and never once missed a school pickup. Make sure you're subscribed, because what a CEO did at my reception, in front of 200 guests, is the part of this story I still have to tell twice before anyone fully believes me. The rehearsal itself went beautifully, which should have warned me. Thursday evening, golden light pouring through stained glass, the officiant walking us through the processional twice. Grandpa stood at the back of the aisle in his cardigan, holding my elbow at the exact pressure of a man who has carried breakable things his entire life and knows precisely which ones might shatter. We laughed. Caleb's sister cried during the practice run, which everyone agreed was a good sign. And then, while the wedding party milled around the vestibule eating Miss Odessa's lemon bars, my father said, "Marisol, a word. Family only." The dressing room off the vestibule is small, all dark wood and choir robes, and my parents arranged themselves inside it like a closing team. My mother held a fresh printout of her seating chart, color-coded, as if the last month had simply been a clerical misunderstanding. My father didn't raise his voice, because the wedding party was one thin door away, and that thin door was entirely the point. He kept it low and reasonable, which is exactly how he delivers his worst lines. "We're asking one final time. Move Frank off the head table. Marcus Holt will be 18 feet away. Directors, spouses, cameras. He's a retired janitor, Marisol. He embarrasses us." And my mother reached into the trash can moment of my entire life. She picked up a head table place card she'd found on her venue walkthrough that afternoon. She'd gone to Ivy Hall. She'd pulled his card, held up that little tent of brown ink, Frank Vance, my $9 calligraphy, and crumpled it. Not angrily. That's the part I still can't shake loose. She crumpled it the way you crumple junk mail, absently, while saying, "We'll have it redone in the calligrapher's hand. It'll look intentional." The paper made almost no sound at all. And in the doorway behind them, holding 3 lemon bars balanced on a napkin he'd brought to share with us, stood my grandfather. He'd heard every word. I watched his spine straighten one vertebra at a time, like a flag being raised. Nobody spoke. Grandpa set the napkin of lemon bars down on the vestment table, gentle as a man diffusing something, and said, "I'll wait in the truck, kiddo." It was the kiddo that did it. The steadiness of it, not a single wobble. A man reassuring his own granddaughter, while his son stood 10 feet away calling him an embarrassment through a half-open door. Something in me went very quiet and very organized, the way it does at 4:30 in the morning when the mail's running late, and there's nothing left to do but sort. I stepped past my father, picked the crumpled place card out of the trash, and smoothed it flat against my knee, crease by crease, taking my time, letting the room watch. Then I turned around. "The seat is his. It's not on the table, Dad. He is the table. He is the only reason there's a family at this wedding at all." My father started to say something about perspective. I wasn't finished. "If you walk out of this church tonight, that's yours to do. But then Saturday you come as guests, regular guests. No run of show, no photo protocol, no seating optics. You tried to buy a better version of this family for $28,000. And when I handed the check back, you started spending relatives instead. The version you want isn't for sale." The dressing room door had drifted open. The wedding party stood frozen in the vestibule, lemon bars halfway to their mouths. And I let them stand there, because my parents taught me that witnesses change behavior. For once, the lesson worked in my favor. My mother recovered first. You're being dramatic. We'll revisit this tomorrow. But my father buttoned his suit jacket. One button, the tell of a man ending a meeting that has stopped going his way. Then enjoy your potluck, he said. They walked past the officiant, past the wedding party, past their own reflections in the sanctuary glass, and the heavy oak door swung shut behind them with a boom like a gavel. Into the silence, our officiant cleared his throat, kind and awkward as a country vet. So, who will be walking the bride? I want to be honest about what winning felt like that night. It felt like losing. There's no trophy for holding a line against your own parents. There's just a parking lot, your fiancé's hand on your back, and a mail truck you sit in at 9 at night, because it's the only place that's ever been 100% yours. Caleb didn't try to fix anything. He just sat in the passenger seat where the packages usually go, folded up like a stork, and held my hand while I shook. Then we drove to Grandpa's, because there was nowhere else the night could possibly end. He'd left the porch light on. He always leaves the porch light on. He took one look at my face, went inside, and came back with two things. A slice of pie I hadn't asked for, and a small square of pressed cotton, white edged in blue forget-me knots. Grandma Louise's handkerchief. Something borrowed. He said she'd want it back eventually, so that part's handled. I laughed and it came out wet. Then my grandfather looked out at the dark yard and said the strangest thing, in the same voice he uses for weather reports. I wasn't always just the custodian, kiddo. But being the custodian was never the part worth being ashamed of. Your dad got that exactly backward. I asked him what he meant. The first part, the wasn't always part. He patted my hand, told me a bride needs her sleep, and stood up with both hands on his knees the way he always does. Conversation over. At the door, I turned around. Walk me down the aisle Saturday. He went still for a moment. You sure you want these old keys jingling down an aisle? That's a yes, Frank. I was home and nearly asleep when my phone lit the ceiling. Mom, 11:04 p.m. We will attend on Saturday for appearances. We owe your father's company that much. I read it 4 times, and by the 4th read, I was almost grateful, because it was the single most honest sentence my mother had produced all year. They were coming back for the audience. The same audience they'd walked out on. The Saturday of my wedding was one of those crisp October days the Blue Ridge hands out as an apology for February, and my parents were there. 3rd pew, right side, dressed impeccably, wearing the smiles they wear in the photos on Mom's real estate flyers. Their decision to come, I later learned, had firmed up about 11 minutes after word of Marcus Holt's RSVP reached the regional office group chat. Whatever brought them, some part of me that will never fully grow up was still glad to see the backs of their heads from the vestibule. And then I stopped looking at them entirely, because my grandfather was standing next to me in his one good suit, the annual meeting suit, navy, older than Caleb, pressed to razor creases, brown shoes glowing with his own elbow grace. His brass key ring had stayed home. He'd tucked the little leather fob into his breast pocket anyway, worn smooth as a river stone. For luck, he said. 40 years of locking up behind everybody. Figured tonight I'd walk somebody in for a change. Don't you dare, I told my eyes. My eyes did anyway. The ceremony was short and true. Delphine played the old upright's cousin, the church organ, like she was 25 again. Caleb's vows had an actual footnote in them, because he's a biology teacher and lost to it completely. Mine were one single paragraph, and the man who'd taught me every word of it sat 6 feet away, in the seat where the father of the bride sits, and nobody had dared to redo that card. At 5 o'clock, as golden hour hit Ivy Hall, our venue manager touched my elbow. Mrs. Reyes, Mr. Holt's car just pulled in. Here's what my parents' version of my reception looked like, because they ran their entire program inside my potluck like an embassy operating on foreign soil. My father intercepted Marcus Holt at the coat check and began what I can only describe as a network safari, steering the CEO from director to director with a hand hovering just above his shoulder blade, his wine glass a prop he never once drank from. My mother had scouted a corner with good light and no support columns, and she gently herded photo-worthy people into it all evening, like a border collie in silk, and 18 feet away sat the version of the evening I had actually paid for myself. The head table on its low riser. Caleb's parents, his sister, my college roommate promoted from the restroom table in one stroke of a pen. And at my right hand, In the seat of honor, with a smoothed-out, crease-scarred place card standing at attention in front of his water glass, Frank Vance. Brown ink, slightly wrinkled, entirely legible. My grandfather held court without saying 50 words, while Miss Odessa and the pantry ladies kept his plate full like a pit crew. Every so often I caught my father glancing at that card, at the wrinkles in it, and looking away fast. The evening was warm, the roses from my mail route were ridiculous and perfect, and Delphine owned that upright piano completely. I had almost stopped watching the room like a carrier watching a loose dog, when I noticed something odd at the far end of the ballroom. Marcus Holt had stopped listening to my father, mid-sentence. His eyes had gone right past Dad's shoulder and locked onto the head table, and his eyebrows were doing something slow and complicated. He squinted the way a man squints at an address he's delivered to before, in another life, on another street entirely. Then he set down his glass. "Excuse me one moment," Marcus Holt said to no one in particular, which in this case happened to be my father, mid-anecdote, and he started across the ballroom. "You have to understand the physics of a room like that. 200 guests, 40 minutes into dinner, everybody watching everybody. And suddenly the most important man in the building is walking a straight line with clear intent." Conversation died table by table in a wake behind him, dominoes going down across felt. My mother's border collie radar swung around instantly. My father stood stranded near the coat check, his anecdote half told, his hand still shaped for a shoulder that had already left. Holt passed the cake table, past the wedding party, past me with a small, unreadable, polite nod. And I remember my whole body going cold with one single thought. He's going to say something about the janitor. This is happening at my wedding. He stopped directly in front of my grandfather. And Grandpa. I will see this moment until the day I die. Grandpa set down his fork, wiped his mouth with his napkin, unhurried, and looked up with the mild, level face of a man who's been waiting for a bus he always knew would eventually come. The whole ballroom had gone so quiet I could hear the ice shift in someone's glass, that little glassy avalanche. Miss Odessa froze with the coffee pot in midair. Delphine lifted her hands off the piano keys and left them hovering. Marcus Holt, Chief Executive Officer of Ridgeline Logistics, 9,000 employees, buttoned his jacket and drew himself up straight, the way men his age do right before saying something they consider historic. "If your heart is pounding right now." Mine was louder, and I was standing in the middle of it in a white dress, with absolutely no idea what was coming. Comment head table right now if you already believed my grandfather had earned that seat, whatever happened next, and stay with me. Because what that CEO said in front of 200 guests and my entire family is the reason this story exists, and my father's face will never look the same to me again. Marcus Holt held out both hands. The two-handed clasp they teach you somewhere above the level my father has ever managed to reach, and his voice carried to the far corners of that ballroom without a microphone anywhere near it. "Welcome back, Founder Vance." That was all. That was everything. I watched the sentence travel across my wedding reception like weather. The Ridgeline tables heard it first, and went from polite quiet to the specific, electric silence of employees doing arithmetic in real time. "Founder Vance. The bride is a Vance. The regional director over there is a Vance. And the old man at the head table, in the pressed navy suit, with the crease-scarred place card standing in front of his water glass. The CEO had just called him founder, with the capital letter audible in his voice. I found my father's face in the crowd, and I will tell you exactly what happened to it, because if this story had a title in my memory it would be his face. It went white, not pale. Wax white. Coat, check ticket white. The color of a man watching 30 years of arithmetic come apart in public. His wine glass tipped in his hand, and a director caught his elbow. My mother, one table over, had stopped moving entirely, her whole face still smiling from the last photograph, while her eyes visibly tried to leave the building. And my grandfather shook Marcus Holt's hand the way he shakes everyone's hand, once, firmly, like a latch closing, and said, "Marcus, you're interrupting the salad course." The CEO of 9,000 employees laughed like a schoolboy, asked if he might join the table, and sat down across from Miss Odessa, who poured him coffee with the serenity of a woman who has fed too many important men to be impressed by one more. The rest of the room stayed frozen inside its own skin, and my father started walking toward the head table. What the room got next wasn't a speech, exactly. Marcus Holt stood with his coffee cup, asked the bride's permission with a small bow that made the pantry lady swoon, and gave my wedding 60 seconds of company history that exists in no brochure anywhere. In 1987, he said Sanders Freight was 90 days from going under, and a depot maintenance man nobody had ever bothered to ask stayed late one night and redrew the entire regional routing system on the back of packing paper. Hub and spoke load consolidation, the bones of everything the company still runs on today. Walt Sanders, God rest him, had the sense to actually listen. The maintenance man became a silent partner, and in 1995, when the company reorganized as Ridgeline Logistics, that partner sold his operating stake back, kept 42% through a holding company, took the title of Chairman Emeritus, and asked for exactly one thing in return: that his name stay out of it entirely. Walt wanted a self-made founder story for the customers, Holt said, and Frank wanted to be home by 6. Both men got their wish, and with Walt 7 years gone now, Holt figured that old promise had finally been kept long enough. I sit with him once a year, Holt said, lifting his coffee toward my grandfather. And once a year he tells me the same thing: that every route this company runs was drawn by a man everybody in the building walked past for years without ever really seeing him. I used to think he was just being modest. A pause you could park a delivery truck in. He was being precise. The pen with the compass rose. The same compass rose that had watermarked my father's slides. The town car Odessa saw once a year. The pension meeting, the good Navy suit. The pencil behind his ear in that hallway photograph. The fat manila envelope in a locked roll-top drawer. Every odd sock in my memory paired itself up in about 4 seconds flat, and I had to grip Caleb's arm across the room just to stay upright. I watched my mother do the same math and arrive somewhere very different. She was already moving her chair. By the time Holt sat down, my parents were closing in on the head table wearing brand new faces. You have never seen a renovation completed as fast as the one my parents performed on themselves in the next 10 minutes. My mother materialized at Grandpa's elbow with a dessert plate, laughing at something he hadn't even said, her chair somehow now adjacent to his, telling Miss Odessa they simply had to get Dad's pie recipe. Dad, a word I had not once heard her use for Frank Vance in my living memory. My father shook Holt's hand and said something about family running deep in this company, and his voice held. That's the training. But his face was still finding its color, and his eyes kept skidding off his own father like a truck sliding on black ice. Grandpa received all of it the way he receives weather. Then my father touched my arm. Hallway, 1 minute, please. The please should have warned me. Out in the corridor by the coat check, my father, 56 years old, senior director of regional operations, looked at me with a face I had wanted my entire childhood. Warm, open, urgent, 100% focused on me. You have to fix this, he said, tonight, before Marcus leaves. Talk to your grandfather. Tell him about the senior VP chair. He listens to you. You're the only one he's ever listened to. I stood there in my wedding dress, hearing it. And then he put the roof on it. And after that, sweetheart, all of this, the rehearsal, the seating, everything, we put it behind us. Clean slate. We're a family again. There it was, everything I'd wanted since I was 6 years old. Offered with a warm hand on my shoulder in a hallway, at a price. 22 years I'd waited for my father to call me sweetheart in that particular voice. It took a stranger's greeting to teach it to him in one single night. I looked through the doorway at the head table, where my grandfather was back on his salad like a man with no history at all. And I felt the oldest muscle in my body flex. The fixer. The translator. The girl who smooths it over. Because here, at last, was the deal I'd been born being trained for. One conversation, and I could have my whole family wrapped and delivered. All I had to do was become the go-between again. All I had to do was spend the seat of honor my grandfather never once asked for on the chair my father had never earned. I heard myself exhale. No, I said. My father blinked. Marisol, you wanted a better table, Dad. He built the room. I said it quietly, the way he taught me without meaning to. Then I walked back into my reception and left him standing in the hallway with his clean slate. What happened next took about 90 seconds and cost me the last version of my childhood I'd been quietly saving. I went to the DJ booth, moved one item up the schedule, and took the microphone. My voice went out over 200 guests, steady as a rote I'd walked 1,000 times. Ladies and gentlemen, the father-daughter dance. Heads turned toward my father in the hallway doorway. I watched people find him, mark him, wait for him to move. And I walked the other way. Past my mother's frozen smile, past the ridgeline tables, to the head table, where I stopped in front of a 79-year-old man in a navy suit and put out my hand, palm up. The way he taught me to offer sugar to a horse. "You've walked me everywhere else," I said. "Walk me through this one too, Grandpa." The room made a sound I can't spell. He looked up at me for a long second, glanced once, only once, at his son by the doorway, and then Frank Vance pushed himself up with both hands flat on the table, took my hand, and led me onto the floor his whole life had earned. Delphine didn't play the song on the schedule. She looked at Grandpa, caught some tiny signal I'll never fully decode, and started "What a Wonderful World" on that old upright, slow and plain, the way it sounds coming from a kitchen radio. My grandfather dances like a man who learned in a living room with a woman he loved. Small steps, a sure frame, counting under his breath out of 50-year-old habit, 1, 2, 3. And I was 11 again, standing on his shoe tops. Except now I was crying onto a navy lapel that smelled like cedar and shaving cream. Around us, the room stood, and I let them blur. I understood something during that song I'd been circling my entire life, and I'll give it to you the way it arrived. Plain. I had spent 22 years believing that belonging to my family was a job with performance reviews. And that if I just managed everything well enough, translated hard enough, smoothed enough edges, I would finally earn my chair. And the entire time, the only person who never once made me apply for his love was the man whose hands were rough from keys and bleach and other people's floors. Belonging isn't wages. It's a gift, or it's nothing at all. Somewhere past the second verse, I whispered the only thing there was left to say, straight into cedar and shaving cream, "Leave every room better than you found it." My grandfather's arm tightened half an inch. "Old men don't sob. They compress. You just did, kiddo," he said. When the song ended, he didn't make a speech. He held my hand up like a square, danced turn, faced the room, and raised his water glass with his other hand. "To my granddaughter," said the quietest man I have ever loved, in a voice that reached all the way to the coat check, who never once asked what a person was worth before deciding to love them. 200 glasses went up. Miss Odessa's coffee pot went up, and by the time the applause washed out and the lights came back to normal, the 2 seats my parents had taken at table 6 sat empty. They had gone. No goodbye. We cut the cake without them. Here's the accounting, 3 months on. Because I know you want it, and because I sort mail for a living, and I like a clean ledger. The Monday after the wedding, my grandfather asked me to lunch at the diner on Chestnut Street and offered, over meatloaf, to set up a trust for me, for Caleb, for the house we rent. I told him no. And I want you to understand it wasn't pride, or anger, or a gesture. It's that I finally understood exactly what he'd been doing for 30 years. Sitting on 42% of an empire out of a 2-bedroom house with a squeakless screen door. The money was never the point of him, and I wasn't about to make it the point of us. I kept the 2 things I'd already accepted, the dance, and Sunday breakfast. I told him the rest of my life I could deliver myself. He grumbled that I was stubborn, which is rich, coming from him. He did do one thing with the money that year, the only public thing he's ever done with it. That spring, the school district announced the Louise Vance Scholarship, full ride, every year, for graduating kids of the district's custodians, cooks, and bus drivers. He made them promise not to put his face on anything. The plaque hangs taped over a door at Lyndale Elementary, the same door it's hung over for 20 years. As for my father, nobody fired him. That's not how any of this works, and honestly, it's better this way. Douglas Vance still parks in the same spot at Ridgeline Logistics and works 1 rung below a chair he'll probably never sit in now. Nobody punished him directly. The story simply got around. The rehearsal, the walkout, the reception. And it turns out optics were the one thing he'd been right about all along. He emailed me in November. 2 lines, no subject. I didn't know. That's not an excuse. I've read it more times than I'll admit. I haven't answered it yet. And here's the thing my therapist and my grandfather agree on, which is a first. I don't owe it an answer on anyone's schedule but my own. The door isn't locked. It's just not my job to hold it open anymore. And it never was. My mother mailed us a crystal picture frame for Christmas, heavy Austrian glass, the card signed Mom and Dad in her flawless open house cursive. I did use it. The photo I chose is the one Caleb's cousin took from the edge of the dance floor. An old man in a navy suit, mid-turn, laughing, and a bride on his arm looking up at him like the whole room belonged to him. Because it did. It always had. We still do Sunday breakfast, 7:30, his kitchen. My turn to bring the eggs. 2 weeks ago I caught him at the sink afterward, washing my coffee mug before I'd even finished drinking from it. Force of habit. I told him the room was fine just as I found it. He laughed until he had to sit down. On the windowsill above his sink, flattened under a jelly jar full of pens, there's a small rectangle of cardstock with a crease scar running down the middle. Brown ink, my best letters. He kept it. My grandfather owned 42% of an empire for 30 years, and never once used it to buy a person. My father chased a title for 30 years and very nearly sold one. So if you take anything at all from my wedding, take this. The seat of honor was never about what either man had, because dignity isn't the name printed on your office door. It's what you leave behind in every single room you're ever trusted to clean. That was Marisol's story. A crumpled place card. A CEO on his feet. One father-daughter dance that finally told the truth out loud. If someone in your family ever mistook a title for a person's worth, tell me that story in the comments. I read every one of them. And tell me this. Who's earned the head table at your wedding? Subscribe to Quiet Reckonings for more quiet people who finally get their say. See you in the next one.